I'll begin by quickly reviewing work on narrative initiated by LAVIS and Walewski in 1967, and then talk a bit about how the focus of analysis has shifted while still retaining their notion of the core structure of the narrative, toward how narratives are embedded in conversation, how they reflect cognitive processes, and how evaluation, in LAVIS' sense, is deployed in the construction and display of social identity in discourse. Then I'll turn to the question of genre in storytelling and introduce the data, a set of what the teller terms recollections that have been commodified through recording for broadcast and sale. I'll play you a short prototypical example, and then I'll discuss how this form of oral discourse, which we all recognize as part of family conversations, has a different structure and form of coherence organized around the notion of digression in relation to both structure, cognition, and which is also linked to subtle indirectness in discourse as a general tendency. I will then try to link the discourse of the recollections to the Irish or more broadly Celtic tradition reflecting settlement patterns in the South, both through its structure and through its social function, drawing for the latter on a recent dissertation on the Irish storytelling tradition. Then I'll talk about how the characteristics of the individual voice located in historical, geographical, and social space. I'll conclude with a couple of remarks on tradition, commodification, and nostalgia. Storytelling, in the form of traditional narrative, is a genre of oral discourse that has received considerable scholarly attention by sociolinguists, drawing on data in the form of personal experience narratives from different sociocultural contexts in the United States. And I don't have time to mention them all here, but I'll simply say that almost all of the stories have been collected from non-Southern speakers. The core narrative is a series of clauses, typically in the past. You recognize this from LAVIS and Walewski, ordered in time as the story is told to match the order of events as they occurred in the past. The basic structure of the oral narrative is the abstract, answering the question, what was this about? The orientation, answering the questions, who, when, what, and where. The complicated action, answering the question, then what happened? The evaluation, and this is, of course, very important, so what? And then the resolution or result, answering the question, what finally happened? And then the coda, which can serve different functions that has to do with relevance to the present moment. In the several decades since this work has appeared, there has been a shift in focus while still retaining the notion of the core structure of the narrative as identified by LAVIS and Walewski. The early work was done on narratives that were elicited in isolation, the famous danger of death stories, and there's been a shift toward looking at how stories occur naturally in the course of ordinary conversation. The work of Chafe, beginning with the famous pair stories, has emphasized the cognitive aspect of narrative production, that is to say, the relation between the oral production of narrative and the flow of consciousness in relation to memory. There has also been an expansion of what LAVIS called evaluation, that is to say, how the speaker makes clear what the point of the story is, toward how artfully the story is told, and toward how evaluation in LAVIS' sense is deployed in the construction and display of social identity and discourse. So, whereas Norek, in his recent book entitled Conversational Narrative, Storytelling and Everyday Talk, doesn't dispute the narrative structure as laid out in LAVIS and Walewski, he simply argues that it's not the most important dimension of a story, and this, of course, is from LAVIS 1972. Turning now to the question of genre in storytelling, another sort of discourse defined by its practitioners as storytelling does not conform to a classic narrative structure, but can easily be imagined as a component of multi-generational conversations on Alabama front porches during long summer evenings. Falling under the general heading of first-person reminiscences and family stories, it has long created categorization problems for folklorists. Such discourse is captured and represented in short pieces heard as commentary on local public radio and then collected on tapes and CDs and sold under the title of Recollections. I think the point here is that we somehow recognize this kind of discourse, even though we always hear it embedded in longer stretches of discourse, which parts that we do have names for, so that it's always backgrounded. This is the problem with taxonomizing, the expectation that things have to fit into a genre. If they don't, the danger is that they're not noticed or that they are assumed not to be important. Norek 2000, in fact, recognizes that some of his corpus of stories don't fit and begins to suggest that there may be other genres which he tries to identify. He proposes what he calls two distinct new genres, namely generalized accounts of recurrent experience and diffuse stories which emerge from ongoing talk, often without clearly marked introductions or endings or responses. Some of the recollections would seem to fit under the generalized accounts of recurrent experience. The argument for the idea that the recollections may represent the prototype of the genre can be found in the fact that the storyteller has made the selection herself and has given them a name as part of the commodification process. The complementary argument from the listener's perspective is that we recognize these segments of discourse from our own experience. Now I'd like to play you an example of a recollection, which in its entirety is clearly not a narrative, from a group of about 40 of these recollections from the preeminent storyteller from Alabama, Catherine Tuscaloosa. She introduces the collection of recollections on the tape by saying, "I'd like to talk about some of those pleasant memories of growing up before they're lost in the fringes of forgetfulness." Well, it would help if we were plugged in. I'm very sorry.
There was this one buzzard sailing around out there in the sky. And he wouldn't flap his wings, and I had to watch him till he flapped his wings. Because everybody knows that if you see one buzzard, it's a real bad luck. Something awful is going to happen to you unless he flaps his wings. But that's when I was such a little guy that nothing ever get it out of my mind. So anytime I see one buzzard, I just have to wait until he flaps his wings. You know, buzzards have always interested me for some reason. They're about as ugly as anything you'll ever see. But they can sail and soar so gracefully, catch those air currents. I used to hear my mother, when she get mad with somebody sometime, and say, "Oh, it just reminds me of an old turkey buzzard." Looked in the encyclopedia not long ago, and I found that turkey buzzards are different from just plain black buzzards. Now we have black buzzards down here, vultures, they really are black vultures. In the south we have. But the turkey vultures are over on the west coast, and they have red heads instead of the black heads the way ours have, and they're also a little bigger. And they find their food, their carrion, by their sense of smell. But our good old black buzzards, they have keen eyesight, and they can spot a dead calf or a dead rabbit or a dead fox most anyway, just kind of swooping down. And I don't think there's anything more repulsive looking than a drove or swarm. I'm not sure what you call a group of buzzards